There is a comforting fiction that has long sustained the Canadian imagination. It is a belief rooted not in power, but in sentiment, a belief that the colossal neighbor to the south is not merely a trading partner, but a permanent and benevolent guarantor of Canadian prosperity. For generations, Canadians have looked at the map and seen the longest undefended border in the world, treating it not as a historical anomaly, but as a promise of stability, exemption, and safety from the harsher realities of geopolitics. That border became a monument to the idea that Canada could exist outside the brutal arithmetic of power, but history is rarely sentimental and geography does not grant immunity. As we look at the trajectory of American politics today, particularly the return of an aggressively transactional nationalism under Donald Trump, we are forced to confront a reality that Mark Carney has articulated with unsettling clarity. The era of automatic exemption is over. The assumption that Canada is family, and therefore protected from American pressure, is no longer simply outdated. It is dangerous, it is nostalgia disguised as strategy, and it is colliding with a world that no longer rewards innocence. What we are witnessing is not a routine trade dispute or a temporary renegotiation of tariffs. It is the potential dismantling of the economic ecosystem that has allowed Canada to punch above its weight for nearly a century. When someone as central to the global financial system as Mark Carney, a man who has steered the central banks of both Canada and the United Kingdom, warns that the global environment Canada once relied upon has fundamentally changed, this is not political theater. It is diagnosis. Carney is not prone to hyperbole. His career has been built on restraint, data, and institutional stability. He is not an activist or an ideologue. He is a systems thinker, trained to identify risk before it becomes catastrophe. When such a figure warns that long-standing assumptions about partnership, predictability, and shared rules can no longer be taken for granted, he is effectively saying that the foundation of the Canadian economic model is cracking. To grasp the seriousness of this moment, we must resist the temptation to focus solely on Donald Trump as a personality. Trump is not the root cause, he is the accelerant. He embodies a deeper shift within American politics, a shift away from multilateralism and toward leverage-based power. In this worldview, trade is not a cooperative enterprise designed to generate mutual prosperity. It is a zero-sum contest. For one side to win, the other must lose. Within this framework, Canada's trade surplus with the United States is no longer evidence of a healthy, integrated relationship. It is reframed as exploitation, as theft, as a grievance that demands correction through tariffs, threats, and unilateral pressure. This is not merely rhetorical hostility. It represents a philosophical rejection of the post-war consensus that governed global trade for decades. For much of the modern era, the North American economy was deliberately engineered to be seamless. The auto worker in Ontario and the parts manufacturer in Michigan were not competitors. They were components of a single synchronized organism. Goods crossed the border multiple times before becoming finished products. Energy, timber, capital, and labor flowed with minimal friction because both countries believed in a rules-based order that privileged predictability over raw power. Donald Trump represents a decisive break from that order. His approach to international relations is openly transactional and unapologetically coercive. Agreements are not binding commitments. They are temporary arrangements, subject to renegotiation whenever political advantage demands it. In this world, rules are constraints to be avoided. Power is the only currency that matters. Carney's warning is that every country connected to such a power must adapt, and Canada is uniquely exposed. This exposure is structural, not accidental. Canada exports the overwhelming majority of its goods to a single customer. When that customer decides to rewrite the terms of engagement based on political impulse rather than economic logic, the relationship ceases to be a partnership. It becomes dependency, and dependency in a transactional world is vulnerability. This is the deeper story that gets lost amid the daily noise of rallies, tweets, and personality-driven media coverage. We focus on Trump's unpredictability, his rhetoric, his temperament, but the real issue is institutional. He has exposed how fragile the international rules-based system truly is, and how dependent middle powers like Canada are on its survival. Powerful nations do not need rules. They have power. Rules exist to restrain power, and therefore they primarily serve those who lack it. Canada is a trading nation, a middle power whose prosperity depends on enforceable norms, neutral arbitration, and predictable markets. When the United States signals that it is willing to bypass the World Trade Organization, weaponize national security exemptions, and treat allies as rivals, the rulebook is not revised, it is burned. Carney's message is that Canada is now operating in a strategic vacuum. The global environment is shifting away from multilateral cooperation and toward bilateral coercion. The post-1945 architecture that governed trade, investment, and dispute resolution is eroding. In its place is a fragmented system where leverage replaces law and size replaces legitimacy. Yet the reaction within much of the Canadian political class has been dangerously complacent. There remains a quiet hope that if Canada avoids confrontation, remains polite, and signals goodwill, the storm will pass, that the special relationship will reassert itself. Carney rejects this outright. Hope is not a strategy. Dependency is no longer safe. This is a profound indictment of the Canadian status quo. It suggests that the very structure of the economy built on easy, frictionless access to the American market has transformed from an advantage into a liability. Canada optimized itself for a world that no longer exists. The mechanics of how this vulnerability unfolds are subtle but devastating. It does not require a formal trade war. Uncertainty alone is enough. The threat of a universal tariff, the targeting of specific sectors like automotive manufacturing, or the mere suggestion of border disruption is sufficient to freeze investment. Capital is cowardly. It does not wait to see if threats materialize. It moves preemptively. If a corporation cannot be confident that the border will remain open next year, or that a sudden executive order will not invalidate its supply chain, it will not build in Ontario. It will build in Ohio, Tennessee, or Texas, inside the fortress. This is the silent erosion of Canada's future, a slow bleed of productivity, innovation, and employment southward, driven not by Canadian failure, but by American unpredictability. Entire communities hollow out without a single dramatic announcement. The damage accumulates quietly, relentlessly. Carney argues that survival now requires a psychological break from the United States. Not hostility, not disengagement, but the abandonment of inevitability. Canada must stop assuming that continental integration will always be there to save it. He speaks of a Canada that is more confident and ambitious, one that looks toward Asia, the European Union, and the Gulf not as supplementary markets, but as strategic necessities. This vision sounds optimistic, but embedded within it is a stark admission. The American century is ending for Canada. The growing interest from countries like the Philippines, Thailand, and Gulf states is not a diplomatic triumph. It is necessity. Canada must find new partners because its primary partner has become unreliable. This shift has consequences far beyond GDP statistics. If you work in manufacturing, agriculture, energy, or logistics, your livelihood is tied to the border. The fracture of the North American market threatens the Canadian standard of living itself. For decades, that standard of living was quietly subsidized by continental efficiency. If that efficiency collapses, costs rise, inflation returns, employment becomes uncertain. Carney argues that Canada is attempting to adjust deliberately, but the pace of disruption may exceed the pace of adaptation. The speed at which protectionism can inflict damage is far greater than the speed at which Canada can build new ports, pipelines, or trade corridors. We are in a race between political disruption and economic diversification, and the margins are thin. Investments from partners like the UAE are significant, but they are dwarfed by the daily volume of trade across a single bridge between Detroit and Windsor. Canada is attempting to replace its economic circulatory system while the patient is still awake. This moment also exposes a crisis of identity. Canada has long defined itself as more orderly, more cooperative, more restrained than the United States, while quietly enjoying American protection and market access. If those benefits are withdrawn, the question becomes unavoidable. What remains? Carney envisions Canada as a stable, reliable partner in a chaotic world, but stability alone does not fund hospitals, universities, or social programs. Those require sustained economic strength. Without trade-driven wealth, the social contract phrase, when we talk about destruction, we are not talking about invasion, we are talking about suffocation, economic isolation that slowly starves the Canadian model of the resources it needs to function. Carney's intervention matters because it breaks the polite silence of diplomacy. Instead of platitudes, he articulates the anxiety that has long existed behind closed doors. The realization that the United States is no longer a guardian of the global order, but one of its most powerful disruptors. He is declaring independence from the psychological comfort of the past. He is naming the core challenge of Canada's future: how to remain sovereign and prosperous when your primary partner decides your prosperity is a threat. This is the end of Canada's adolescence, the moment when dependency is no longer affordable, the moment when sovereignty must be earned, not assumed. The old maps no longer describe the territory ahead. Whether Canada is ready to make that pivot remains an open question, but the illusion that it can avoid the choice is already gone.